tecumerias in California, and everybody rolls their eyes when we say we have tecumerias that are shrub form. And if you look at this plant is growing upright. It's not having really long internodes and stretching like most of the tecumerias that we see in the market here. So this is a Cape Town series. There's 5 colors in them. This is the pink. But these are bred to be bush-like. So they're going to still get to be 4 or 5 feet tall in the landscape, but they're going to stay nice and compact. They're heavy blooming plants. These are plants that they're a moderate to low water use depending on where you put them, but they're almost in bloom year round. So from a pollinator perspective, I'm really looking at plants that will give pollinators something to be happy about in off season. So these bloom super early when there's not a lot of other plants that are blooming, and they'll bloom in the fall. We need pollinator plants to bring into the gardens to pollinate our vegetables. And the time of the year that we really need to look at specifically, like I said, is that early spring and that later fall time frame, because there's not a lot of other things blooming. You don't really have to worry about having plants in bloom in April or May or June, because everything wants to bloom there. But you really need to kind of plan strategically to have things in bloom during the shoulder seasons, as we like to call them. Speaking of bloom, so here's my horticultural question. It's my mystery plant, and I love this because this is lavender merlot. This is coming out of New Zealand. It is the best lavender for California. I've had a lavender and merlot now in my garden for 10 years. They really like our climate. They're particularly suited for California. They don't like to have wet feet. They can take extremely low water, but I have never had mine bloom. So that's my number one question I get is, what do I do to get my lavender or merlot to bloom? And I have no idea. And here, Lewin brought me one from here, and it's absolutely stunningly beautiful. When they bloom, they obviously are very nice, but we sell them primarily for the foliage. The nice thing about this plant, I encourage everybody to come up here and pet this plant and give it a whiff. There's super strong lavender fragrance in the leaf, so you don't really need it from the flower. This is a good natural moth repellent. You can cut the foliage, make potpourri, bring it into your house. So the Japanese do that. They actually wrap the kimonos, their silk kimonos, in lavender to keep the moths out. So this is an extremely strongly scented lavender, and you can bring it in and make a potpourri from that too. So this is lavender merlot. There's a gazillion boxwoods sold. Boxwoods are probably the number one shrub sold in the United States, but we like the pits here. So this is a dwarf Pittosporum tenuifolium type. This is called beach ball. I named it beach ball because there's one on the market called golf ball that's getting to be about 12 to 15 feet tall in the landscape. So I was a little tongue-in-cheek of me on this one, but this really is going to be about a beach ball. If you don't prune this at all, it will stay about 3 to 4 feet maximum. I have them in pots in my garden. I only give them a little tiny pinch, maybe once a year, maybe even every 2 years. They really don't need much maintenance at all. So if you want a nice green, low maintenance, easy to take care of shrub, this is Pittosporum beach ball. And we also have a diamond, which is a variegated version of this. So I think the number one sold plant right now in our collection for sure, but also maybe in landscape, Lomandra Platinum Beauty. There's something about this plant. A lot of the green Lomandras don't take full sun well in hot climates. Then they don't really take it well in the Central Coast, in the Central Valley particularly. But for some reason, this plant really shines no matter where you put it. You can put this against a brick wall in native soil in Fresno, and it will thrive. I mean, these things are impossible to kill, which I like. Hard plants to kill are good plants. So Lomandra Platinum Beauty, it has won a gold ribbon from UC Davis. It's an extremely low water plant. They can take winter wet and summer dry, which is always nice. We have our display garden in Sonoma at Cornerstone. The first year these were planted, they got 60 inches of rain and were in standing water for 3 months. And then they went all summer dry. So these are very tough plants. They're very beautiful plants. I love them in the wintertime when it's dark and you get this beautiful movement in the foliage. They're just really spectacular plants. And again, so here's my other dilemma. How big does this plant get? Everyone's mad at me because we're saying that they get 2 to 3 feet tall. Well, I've had to say now they get 4 to 5 feet tall, but in my garden where I do not water them, I do not fertilize them, they're staying 2 feet. We've seen them 5 feet by 5 feet in landscapes, and I think it's because people are loving them to death. They're giving them too much water, too much fertilizer. So a lot of these plants, too, you heard about the phosphorus on the grevilleas and the leucadendrons, but a lot of these plants don't really need very fertile soils. They actually prefer a lower fertility, and if you give them too much, they're just going to keep growing and growing on you. Cistus. So this is you can tell, this is a very compact, variegated cistus. This is Little Miss Sunshine. And she gets a really beautiful white flower on it. So you're not going to get a big garish pink flower on these. This is a white blooming cistus. Nice, holds its variegation very well, and it stays very compact. So about a 24 to 36 inch plant. It's a good front of the border plant. But again, extremely low water use, very tough plant. And everybody loves succulents. So we had to find a succulent. This is Senecio Skyscraper. It's coming out of Africa. It's a breeder in the Netherlands that started off with these African plants. So most of the Senecios that we see are more of a ground cover. They kind of flop over. This guy's still young, so you can't see, but if you have a chance, come up and look at the picture on here. In Southern California, these are getting to be 7 feet tall, and they grow straight up. So I always say full sun, because if they get too much shade, they start to stretch. This is Mahonia soft caress. So most Mahonias are really prickly, and you would want to back into them if you were gardening. But this one has absolutely no pricks to it at all. It's extremely soft. It's a Eurobracteantha types coming out of China. But they bloom, for us in California, they repeat bloom. So they're blooming now, they'll bloom again in the wintertime. Hummingbirds absolutely go crazy for this. Bees, this is another great pollinator plant that is going to be blooming again in that fall and winter time when we don't have a lot of other things in bloom. But I don't water. I have all of these planted in my garden. I live in Berkeley. And other than, full sun on this is a little bit touchy, but I don't water any of my plants once they're established. So I'm a kind of a tough love person. So they need to get established. We talked about that a little bit. It can take 2 to 3 years to get a plant established in the landscape. But these are plants that, in the proper situation, will not require additional water for us on a typical year in Northern California. And if we have an exceptionally hot climate, or it's hot year, or we don't have an average rainfall year, or we're getting a little bit less, you might want to give them 1 or 2 irrigations in the summertime. But typically what I'm looking for are things that can really tough it out. Last but not least, Tacomas. So there's a breeder in Arizona, George Hall, who started working on Tacoma breeding. Tacomas are native to Texas, and they're typically, again, 20, 30-foot trees. Very seedy. They tend to reseed and go out of bloom and just be kind of a mess. So he was working on varieties that were more compact, that bloomed heavier, that did not produce viable seeds, so you don't have to worry. That's something else I will say is I'm very, very aware of not having anything that's potentially invasive, so nothing's going to be reseeding. It's a pet peeve of mine that there's a lot of plants, again, grown and sold in California that are not from here that will reseed and become an issue. So that's something that I will not do to you, I promise. But this is Lydia, and there's also one called Bells of Fire. Very loved. Again, those tubular flowers are hummingbird magnets. The butterflies, the bees, everything love them. So,
Chrysocephalum silver and gold is an introduction by, guess who? Well, I told you if you're looking at the sheet, by UC Santa Cruz Arboretum. And this is an Australian native. It's a selection for its low-growing, spreading habit, but it doesn't spread too much. It spreads about up to 3 feet. And the flower, it's a quote-unquote daisy flower, is almost dried on the plant. So because of that, the flowers are everlasting on the plant as well. So in our coastal climate, bay climates, this plant can be in bloom almost year-round. Eventually, you have to cut off the old flowers because they do age to a certain degree, and you want to clean up the look of the plant. So I think it's a very handsome, xeric, deer-resistant plant that doesn't get too widespread. And so for a lot of smaller gardens, and if you want to incorporate it with succulents or in rock garden effects, it won't get out of hand. And it will give you brightness. Now, some people just don't go with gold. And I think, well, you live in the Golden State. That's really interesting that you're not going for gold. but this one has silver and gold. So it's one of my favorite garden plants. And then next would be, let's see, probably Corea. Is that next? Corea Kangaroo Island. Well, that happens to be UC Santa Cruz Koala Bloom's introduction. And we're happy to have grown this plant, and we've developed quite a fondness for it. And a lot of you know there's a lot of different Koreas, and a lot of them are, some people say Korea, some people say Korea. I used to say Korea, now I say Korea. So I used to say, don't change the way you say it, always say it the same. Well, I broke my rules, so I say Korea now. So this Korea reflexa, and there's a lot of different reflexes. The species is really happy to propagate itself and offer its diversity of offspring. And so this is a selection of reflexa from Kangaroo Island off the coast of Australia, and it has a great habit. And it also seems to be in bloom pretty much every season of the year. And so the hummingbirds are happy about that. And the gardeners are happy about that because it gives you color throughout the seasons. What I really like about it is its habit. It grows about 4 feet tall and 3 to 4 feet wide. Actually, more like 3 feet wide. So it's taller than wider. A lot of the Koreas are just the opposite. They're wider than taller. So they're more spreading, kind of like ground cover, but not really. But for spreading habit to fill in amongst taller plants. This one is good for like a medium height screen. So in a lot of courtyard gardens now, when people are converting their lawns into xeriscape, they're doing low walls and such, and they don't really want to wall off the neighbors necessarily. Sometimes they do, but in a lot of cases they don't, and they'll use grasses or restios for that. And this plant can do that too, and can be mixed in that kind of setting because its height really maxes out at around 4 feet. And so it's easy to maintain. And it doesn't take forever to get there. It takes 3 or 4 years to get there. But that's a nice characteristic of some of the Koreas as well, is they don't just keep growing. And this is one of them. So I'm a big fan of this Korea reflexive Kangaroo Island. And happy that UC Santa Cruz introduced it. And so next we have Grevillea Moonlight. So Grevillea Moonlight, you've probably passed around, and some of you I'm sure, or maybe a lot of you know this plant. It's my favorite Grevillea. What I like about it is you can train it into a small tree and expose the trunk. And so for a lot of gardens that have converted from lawn to xeriscape, there's this different feel now because you've got all this open space and all this sky above it, so let's put a tree out there. Well, there needs to be care about the size of the tree with power lines and gas lines and what have you. And so this can be trained into a tree that'll stay around 12 feet tall. So there's a lot to be said for small trees. And I'll talk a little bit about this new Tibouchina, how that can be a small tree as well. So that's a big reason I like Grevillea. Also, there's a few other really good reasons, and the flowers are big. They can be up to 6 inches long. This one has lots of nectar, so lots of nectar, lots of hummingbirds, and lots of other insects that can get in there, which a lot of them can, and drink that nectar. Also, it lives up to its name. It catches the moonlight. So if you have this plant, you know that. Under the moon or a street light, it will glow. And there's something to be said for that in the dark garden, which, because of this plant, is not as dark. So one of my favorites, if not my favorite, Grevillea. Next, we have Leucadendron blush. Okay, leucadendrons. We've had a affair with leucadendrons for a long time, and because of the Arboretum, blush I think was hybridized, or not hybridized, but selected in South Africa. And here's blush, and some of you may have grown blush. What I really appreciate about blush is, again, for gardens that are converting to a more xeric garden, getting away from lawns and creating different kind of textural effects, ups and downs, and grasses and succulents and all these different things. So it's all a process. Blush really fits into that well because it gets maybe 4 feet, and that's And a lot of the leucadendrons, which we love, get 6, 8, 10 feet, like Safari Sunset or Red Gem or Sylvan Red. So those are the ones you see a lot in gardens around. And the good thing about that is if they're too big, leucadendrons, from our experience, can take the hardest cutting of pretty much of anything in the Protea family. This is a leucadendron Selenium golden tulip. And this was growing on Mike Estoni's hillside from some seedlings of Seleniums that he grew. And this was, 30 some years ago. And we saw these different forms, and I can't sell them as cut flowers, they're too short. And we're looking at, well, they're wonderful bank covers. There's some lower growing male Seleniums that have really tight leaves, one called Dragon Eye. Now it's just starting to form, and it's to me a counterpart of blush, because you can have on one side of your garden or next to it or however you want to do it, a big rock is nice, you can have golden tulip. And golden tulip will be a golden tulip in the winter, fall, winter, late winter, early spring, depending. There is some variation in that. And the size, it doesn't get too big. So another 4-footer. So it's not going to take over the front yard. And we like that. So this is not in bloom, but I hope you've seen the pictures of this plant, this leucospermum. And it's cordifolia. This red one is my favorite. And so if I could only plant one leucospermum in a garden, which is just, it's a fake to say that, but I'm going to say it. If I could only plant one, it would be probably this one. The Lomandras, we've grown a lot of them and used a lot in landscapes over the last 10 years. And so I'm watching them, seeing what they'll do. The first one that really got popular is Breeze. And that was probably, about 15 years ago or so. And it's a tough plant. We have a Breeze from one of the original samples in the garden that's 15 years old, and it's in an obscure spot. We've never done anything to it. And now we're really cutting back hard. We've never done anything to it. And it's just super, super tough.
They're commonly called Australian fuchsias. They're not related to fuchsias. They're citrus, but they're just a whole range of colors. And they range from ground covers to some that'll get to be quite tall shrubs. But usually I think of them as kind of moderate sized ones. I'm just going to talk about three. All three of these are Arboretum introductions. This is Coria, strawberries and cream. This one grows 4 to 5 feet tall and wide. This was actually one of Ray Collette's selections, and he named it. They're these really pretty and well-displayed tubular pink flowers with kind of creamy yellow tips, or almost whitish tips. Anyhow, really a lovely plant. And this one is Coria Party Popper. And we named it that because it really does look like little party poppers. The flowers, really soon as they're developing, just split right along the seams and flare out. It's worth looking at up close. And then this final Coria is Coria Cape Nelson. We had a number of Corias from Cape Nelson region. This one was so stunning in the garden that we gave it cultivar status. So the others, it's a really subtle difference unless you, a lot of them on the names will just have a long dash, Cape Nelson, meaning yes, it's from Cape Nelson. This one, we gave it its own cultivar status. There's several of those planted out in the Australian rock garden, and they're just getting ready to bloom now. They're low. They grow maybe 2.5 feet tall and about 4 feet wide, and just very, very showy, even from a distance. One little drawback with some of the Corias is they're not that showy from far away. You have to get up close to really appreciate the flowers. So that's why you would put them alongside a pathway where you can be close to the plants, or put them in a container where you're closer still. This doesn't look like much, and yet I really just wanted to give a shout out to this plant because Again, in the rock garden, it's one of the very best foliage plants. This is Leptospermum star carpet, and it just drapes over the rocks incredibly. It's just a very beautiful texture and very graceful. And when it does bloom, it's covered with white flowers. So, and Lewin already talked about Grevillea superb. I just have to concur with everything he said. It's probably one of the most popular and most photographed plants in the Arboretum because there's a whole crescent of those out in the Banksia field, and there's almost always photographers there taking pictures of the hummingbirds. It's in bloom all year long. If there's a freeze, it will, knock down the flowers. Here where we are, the plant itself holds up fine. Mountain areas, I don't think you'd be able to grow it. And then I can't help but mention probably my favorite genus is the Banksias. Perhaps one of the disadvantages to this is that they're just so showy and so dramatic that they don't blend in with a lot of gardens. You're not going to put these in your cottage garden or your, California native garden. But I mean, wow, look at that. I'll just go through them really quickly. Banksia victoriae, Banksia speciosa, the rickrack Banksia. These two together make a really incredible, just dramatic bouquet without much effort. You take a few stems of the Adenanthus sericea and a couple of these, and you've got it. This is a great big tree Banksia, Banksia seminuda. It's probably 40 feet tall, really fast growing. And even though it's called the river Banksia, we don't water them at all. There's this yellow form that just looks like candles on this great big tree. And then there's also a red and orange form. Oh, and I saved the most demure little one for last. Banksia occidentalis. Nice for smaller scale. This one is actually a little bit thirsty. It needs more water than, the other Banksias don't need any water. This one appreciates some. And Banksia media.